Okay, the stage is yours, Juri. Take it away.
All right. Are we ready with the slides? Awesome. Perfect. Yeah, I want to talk a bit today about the whole spectrum from consolidating, enhancing, and scaling a monorepo. And we're obviously going to talk a bit about NX. So, monorepos are great, right? I mean, we're at the Monorepo conference. So I think I can say that without any issues. There's a lot of different benefits that people talk to us about. Like it's reducing communication overhead, ideally within our team. It's kind of helping us facilitate collaboration and code sharing. Like ultimately, it should help us ship faster and hopefully with higher quality. That's kind of the goal. But you can already hear the tone of my voice. Like there's a but, right? There's trade-offs, like with every technology or tooling you're adopting. And so they do come with free, and I often call this the pain points you don't see yet, right? Because you might be in a polyrepo setup, you kind of start feeling a bit of the pain of like keep sharing code, keep deploying it, keep like managing different versions. And so then there's this shiny toy, the monorepos, with all these benefits, so let's just jump on it, right? But it comes with some pain points. And well, let's maybe not call it pain points, let's call it challenges. And so I want to talk a bit about these three big blocks, right? So you want to migrate from a potential polyrepo setup to multiple single repos into a monorepo. Then you want to enhance it, right? You want to make sure you actually leverage the benefits of a monorepo, because otherwise it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And then finally, you need to address also the scaling aspect, right? And so with NX, we want to try to kind of cover and give you something and support you along the whole spectrum of this, right? So from the actual first migration, consolidation phase, to enhancing, to scaling. So my name is Juri Strumpflohner. I'm currently Senior Director of Developer Experience at NX. I'm also a Google Developer Expert. And I also do some video courses occasionally on Arcade.io. And so let's jump right in with the first one, which is consolidating. And there's one thing that is almost like a must, right? It's incremental. It needs to be incremental. Like no one can actually say, well, let's stop for like 4 or 5 months. Let's just migrate everything over, and that will be ready, super productive, and go ship. Like that just doesn't work in reality. So you have this setup, which this can be like multi-repo setup, and there are still some dependencies among those, right? They might be more looser in the sense of like there might be some runtime API connection between these projects. There might be some internal NPM publishing where you have within your organization a local registry where you publish stuff and then reuse in our repos. So there is some connections in there. And ideally, in an incremental phase, you want to take this and move it over to that single repo, right? Either one by one, or move it over, but leave it almost untouched. I'm saying almost because like obviously you can benefit already from some direct connections, like for NPM. Like you don't have to publish anymore, right? Just depends on the latest version. But that's kind of it. So that's kind of like the first step I wanted to look a bit into. So let's have a look what that means for a single project, just to break it down, start simple, right? So roughly, I think by now, like 1.5 years ago, we introduced a command that's called NX init. So rather than creating a new monorepo from scratch, so greenfield project, you just apply this command on any type of repo. It can be a single project, can be a monorepo. And what NX is going to do is it figures out the setup and then installs itself into the monorepo and configures itself. And this is a very minimalistic setup in the sense that what you get is an NX package, single NPM package, and then you get the metadata file, which is like NX JSON. So it gives just NX some information about what it should do. You don't have to have it, but it doesn't make sense really without it. Because here's what you define, for instance, what operations are cacheable. You can define some task pipeline dependencies, etc. And what do you get? Well, you can now run it through the NX pipeline. You can run multiple commands at once in parallel, optimized. You get some caching out of it. So if operations have run already before, it just like doesn't run them anymore. But the important part is this uses just existing scripts that you have. Like in this case, it's like a JavaScript repo. So it just uses your package JSON scripts, and it doesn't really touch anything else. And this is a big advantage because like the chances that things are breaking is actually pretty low. So you get some benefits, but like you minimize the actual breaking parts potentially in your setup. Now you might be wondering, like for a single repo, is it really worth it? Like why would I do it? And it's kind of a legit point, right? Like you don't really get a huge gain in, let's say you have a single remix repo, remix project, and just add NX to it. But for an existing monorepo, it actually makes sense. Let's say you have your PNPM workspace with a bunch of different projects, it works for you, but at some point you feel the scale of it, like you run into some issues in terms of speed. At that point, NX can kind of bring in like the fact that you can just take the existing scripts, keep going with those, but you get the task pipelines, and you also get caching, locally and remote, potentially, right? The point here is you manage this, right? You still take your existing repo, and you manage these setups, make sure they're in sync, you upgrade them over time as you keep adjusting your monorepo, and that's fine, right? That's perfectly legit. But when we think about these use cases, usually the thought is always like, can we do better? Like, you get the setup that you already have, but can we kind of help you without being too invasive? And so very often what we bring up and like keep pushing forward is NX plugins. And these are NPM packages that you can add on top of your setup. And the main goal there is that NX plugins take care of the tooling. So they take the tooling that you might be using already, but they make sure it works well in a monorepo setup, which might need some fine-tuning, right? And so the plugins handle that for you. They configure caching for you, and the goal is you just focus on shipping, right? So you don't really worry about the rest of it. And they have been, I have here historically, because you can still use this setup, but historically, they have been more kind of opinionated and more restrictive in a sense, because if you just build, like there's some options you provide to such a plugin, how it should build, then you give the type of the build system. In this case, it's like a Vite build, it could be a Webpack rollup, etc. And the plugin then knows how things work. And this is opinionated, clearly, right? So we know where files should be, how it should be configured. And for greenfield projects, this is amazing, because you don't have to know a lot about the underlying tooling. You just get going, right? So you create a new workspace, the plugins will configure the tooling for you. You just keep focusing on developing actually the product and shipping features. Now what we noticed though is like for migrating existing projects, it's kind of more complicated, right? Because like you have to do this mapping step in between where you maybe port your existing setup, your existing build scripts, like your Vite, Webpack setup, etc., over to the more NX specific plugin setup. And as you can see here on this side, this is very high-level, non-technical illustration of how a plugin looks like historically seen. It's like it takes these options, it feeds them into the plugin kind of knows what it needs to do with it, and the plugin itself wraps some of the technology underneath. So it actually might access lower-level programmatic APIs of the tooling and then produces the artifacts kind of at the end of the cycle, right? And so it's more of like a black box. So what we actually would want, though, is the use case which we had initially was like the NX init, right? Super lightweight, super minimalistic, but enhanced with some of the stuff that the plugins do, because they're actually pretty powerful. It might just be harder to migrate to them initially. And so our thought keeps coming up, and this is something also that Victor mentioned in the keynote. At some point we were like, what if like plugins are more like the VS Code extensions? So if you think about that, like I often make the Playwright example. Like you can use VS Code and run Playwright tests without any issues, right? Works. But if you add the Playwright plugin, it's actually pretty neat, because you get like these in the gutter, these icons where you can run tests directly. You get a test explorer, it kind of filters out some of the stuff. So it's enhancing your experience when working with Playwright tests in VS Code. And that's kind of the idea that we would want to have. Like you get a setup, everything works, but we want to enhance it with some more stuff to take away from you. So it's kind of the whole thought about like we want to enhance, but don't really interfere with whatever you're doing right now. And so what we try to do is like move from this perspective to something like this. Again, high level, non-technical, right? So it's very, like, we move the build tooling outside, we just invoke directly the underlying CLI, but we still do some of the fine-tuning that you might want to do. And there's a crystal here, because we named this project Crystal, and that's when you hear like NX Crystal plugins. Those are the type of plugins that try to interfere less with what you do, and are usually much, much easier to adopt in an existing reality. And so what we do here is, instead of like providing a whole set of options, which you can still provide, but you don't have to, we actually rely much more on the underlying tooling config. So for Vite, it's the Vite configs, Webpack config, et cetera, depending on what tool you're using. And we read information out of that, and we already make sure things are keeping in sync. So that means also we know what targets you usually run when you have like a Vite setup. For instance, there's for sure dev, build, and preview target you can invoke. So we automatically infer and generate that as well. So you don't have to specify it anymore if you don't want to override it for some reason. And so that has the big advantage that the cache output directory will always be in sync, because we just read it out of the Vite config. You for some reason change the output directory, tooling will automatically pick it up, in this case, the NX plugin. And so this is what it looks like in such a crystal setup. So you can see here on the one side, the project JSON file, which is the configuration file for like an NX workspace, an NX project, is empty, right? So if you don't have any custom target set up, it's empty. You actually don't even necessarily have to have it. And on the right-hand side, you see basically the dynamic generated view. This comes from our NX console extension, which is for VS Code and WebStorm. But you can also just run it in a local browser environment. This shows you the different targets that got inferred from the tooling setup. So we know, since it's a Vite setup, there will be build steps, dev steps, etc. And if we open up one of those, you can see there is like a cacheable marker. So we know this should be cacheable. As a command, it just runs Vite build, right? So it just refers to the local actual CLI of Vite. And if we scroll further down, we also see there's some inputs and outputs configured. So it also pre-configures the caching for you. So again, it takes away some of that burden from you. You don't have to think about it anymore, basically. But you still kind of don't have to change a whole lot of different things on your existing setup. And as you can probably anticipate, it turns out this works really, really well for importing. So meaning importing existing projects into a monorepo. And so that's why we started creating an import command, NX import, which does exactly that. And so here is a setup for a Java project. This is a Spring Boot application that uses Gradle underneath. And we're just going to import it into an existing workspace. So you can see here, it's like just normal setup. Like there's a product controller. It has a Gradle plugin configuration, a Gradle config file. And so clearly you can run all the different Gradle commands, right? Like Gradle build, Gradle test. And if I move over now to my existing monorepo, I can just run an import in here. So this is a monorepo with a bunch of Next and React apps and Angular apps in here, some libraries. And so if I import now my Gradle setup, my Gradle-based project, it asks a couple of questions: which branch you want to import it, where you want to place it in the existing monorepo. And then it detects the plugins. So it found the NX Gradle setup because there's a Gradle config file and suggested to install that. So now the project is in. It actually ports over the existing Git history, so you don't lose that from the original project. And so now you can basically run a command to show whether it got recognized. So you see the API project, which is our Gradle project, got pulled in. And if you open the build file and you have NX console installed, you actually get that icon that now shows you all the inferred targets, as we have seen before. So you see there's still the boot run, there's the test command, there's the build command. You see it's cacheable, like all the text automatically. Just use the underlying Gradle build command. And it also has the input and outputs configured, right? So caching is set up. And that basically means we can now run commands as before, but we use NX for it. So we run NX build, we run NX test, and we can also chain it with others, right? So we run many, build test, and we'll just run it regardless whether it's a Gradle file, a JavaScript project, React project, etc. And obviously gets cached. And finally, it shows up also in the project graph. So it's literally as all the other projects in the repo. And this is what the plugin allows us to do, right? So this is what the plugin did. We didn't do any sort of configuration on top of it. Just pull it in, plug in the tag, the Gradle file, pre-configured it. So that's kind of the power that I was kind of hinting towards. OK, so now this is kind of the consolidation phase. And you can also import multiple projects, right? So I just took one example of putting in one project into an existing repo. Let's move over to the enhancing phase. When I say enhancing, I mean we have this setup now in our repo, but it's not really leveraging a whole lot of the monorepo setup. You just pulled in the existing projects. What you start doing usually is you split them up, right? You create smaller projects that are more usable, we can basically better allocate teams to these projects. You start kind of splitting that up and kind of leveraging the monorepo tooling better if you have smaller pieces. And so it quickly starts kind of becoming more of these projects, and it can even turn into something like this, right? We have just a ton of different projects in the monorepo because it's easy to create new ones, and people just start kind of cross-referencing all of these. And so that's when you start to have to do some sort of like control mechanism on top, right? You need to start thinking about how do we control this type of structure such that it is still maintainable as we keep going on. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, we need to kind of standardize some of the things. So where are projects being placed inside my monorepo? How are they being set up, right? We want to have some sort of like organizational standards that we want to impose. And the best way to do that is usually to automate. All right, so I'm not going too deep into that, but one of the ways to automate that in an NX repo is to use generators, right? So the plugins that I mentioned before provide some of these, so they have it built in. But many companies just create their own, because it's pretty easy, right? We have like an actual dev kit, which allows you to create your own generators where you can reuse existing ones, but kind of really tailor them to your needs inside the company. So maybe some of the questions you don't even ask. Like if someone says, I'm creating a new product for my orders domain area or whatever, or you are in the team of the orders managing projects, it will know in which subfolder of the monorepo the project should go. So you can actually really fine-tune this sort of process. All right, so once you have something like that set up, it's very easy and straightforward to create new projects. There's the next thing that you need to think about, hinting to a talk that we had just a couple of talks before, which is the whole ownership part. Who reviews the code, right? You want to make sure, especially if the monorepo gets bigger, that the right people are reviewing the right parts. And this goes back to the structure that I mentioned before. As you keep creating such a structure, you kind of start to identifying different areas. Usually they reflect domain areas that you have within the team, within the type of company you are. It can be department-wise organized. So that really depends on how the setup looks like. But the fact is that you start building such areas where you can clean it and assign owners, right? So everyone knows the team members of that team, so they should probably review their code. Now, most of the time, it will be that team contributing to that part of the repo. But in a monorepo, it shouldn't always be the case, right? If there is some connecting parts and I change an API, which I break some code over there, but I don't already know how to fix it, I can totally submit a PR for that as well. But it should be some of them to review that, actually, because there might be some side effects I have not thought about. So that's kind of the idea behind the whole ownership part. And code owners is one way to actually do that, right? You specify for each kind of folder structure that you have, who should it review when a PR is being opened. Now, code owners are file-based. So meaning you need to define the different, either at the glob parent level, or you need to define all the folders and assign teams or groups or people names who should review these different parts of the code. And one downside of that is you need to keep it aligned with the project structure of the monorepo. So as you keep moving projects around, you need to make sure to keep that in sync. And so again, we thought, can we do better? Can we kind of enhance that experience a little more? And this is when we started introducing what we call NX Power Pack, and code owners is one part of that. And so by installing a package, we basically introduce a different way of defining code owners, which is closer to how you usually manage your setup. And so with that, you basically have such a configuration in your NX.json, which allows you to first still at a global glob pattern level. For some reasons, that might make sense. But it also allows you to define it on a tag basis. Now let's have a look what that actually means. You define these. You can run a command called nxsync, and that would then produce the actual output. So here's a small demo of how that looks like. So you can install that package using the nxadd command. nxadd just does more, right? It installs and then runs some initialization script. And then you can define such a code owner's configuration, right? You define the pattern for GitHub, GitLab, or whatever you're using. And then you define these different projects. And you can also use a tag to identify the project. A tag means in your project.json or package.json, NX allows you to define such a string base that you attach to the project, which is useful for more things, actually. And then once these projects have a tag and specified in the code owners file, you run nxsync, and it will then generate the file patterns, the glob patterns that it needs to properly assign the owners. So here you see the one that we had initially for DevOps part, but then for all the others, I didn't have to specify exactly where that project is located in my monorepo. Clearly, NX figured that out based on these tag patterns that we allowed to have. And this allows you to kind of reduce a bit of the maintenance burden on these code owners files, right? Because you just move projects around, and they will still keep in sync based on this tagging mechanism. Next thing is scaling, right? So we looked into some of the enhancing parts, and there's more, right? So I touched just on some of the aspects there. The next part is scaling, because clearly at some point, your monorepo keeps growing, so you need to look into more of these areas, and which is not just the code ownership, which is kind of a bit blurry because it goes a bit also into scaling. You kind of need it at a certain scale only. But the next thing is verifying boundaries, right? So we establish these boundaries, but at the same time, we want to make sure things stay within the boundaries, and you can control what can depend on what other projects within your monorepo. And again, automation is kind of the key there. And this is what we call conformance. And again, we pack this into one of these Power Pack plugins, which you can install into your setup. In this case, it's NX Power Pack Conformance. And what it allows you to do is to define rules, right? And one of these rules is an owner rule. So in this case, you can see I configure here the Power Pack Conformance ensure owners. And then in this case, I just exclude the end-to-end tests. But what it allows me to do now, this is a baked-in rule, is to make sure that every project has an owner actually assigned, because this is something I would want to do, right? If I instantiate a new owner, a new project, I want to make sure this is also covered by someone that reviews it. Now, ideally, again, kind of hinting back to the generation phase, you might pre-generate that as well as your part of your custom generator. And so when you run this and one of the projects doesn't have an owner, you would get such a notification. And you would run this on your PR, on your CI. And so immediately your PR will be blocked. You look into it. Oh, well, I forgot to define the owner for this new project. You go fix it, etc. Another one is the project boundaries enforcement that I just mentioned before. This allows you to define different constraints. Like this is the full configuration right now, where you can see different options, also in terms of like circular dependencies configuration, etc. But the main part here that I want to highlight is the middle one, which is the dependency constraints between projects. So you can say something like, here my source tag backend, which is like our API or Gradle API that we imported, cannot depend on those that have been declared of type frontend, right? Because we don't want to have that direct dependency. We might have some shared parts in between, but we don't want to have direct dependencies. And so this is the type of thing that you can check with these conformance rules. And so another part is you can also customize them, because we have some baked in, but you can also create your local conformance rules. It's a matter of creating a TypeScript file and then basically configuring the rule, something like this. This is just obviously like a sample that I pasted in here. But you can then configure the behavior of this rule inside here. You don't have to pre-compile it. It will automatically be loaded in by the conformance plugin and ran on your code base. Then you run this on your CI, and it would automatically run the checks, and you can see all of these different parts in here. Like here, for instance, like there's a project of type frontend that depended on a backend, so it would emphasize that and block your PR from being merged. Now, this is an early version of it that we just launched a week ago, 1.5 weeks ago. The main power of this one, because this is pretty similar to also like an ESLint-based rule that we already have, the main power of this one is this goes across the tech stack. So while ESLint is mostly JavaScript focused, this works across, as we have seen, also Java projects and other types of projects. And in addition, if we pair this up then with NXCloud, you could even run these rules on all of the projects that are connected with your organization. So it can even go across monorepo boundaries in the future. And then finally, scaling CI, right? So there's always a part that at some point kicks in, because as you keep adding new projects, your CI will go up. That's for sure. If you don't do any sort of optimization, that's going to happen, which then again kind of almost neglects the benefits of having a monorepo in the end. And so we want to keep that as low as possible. And our main answer for that is NXCloud. So NXCloud is really our CI part of that optimization, where we want to make sure that CI is actually optimized and kept as low as possible. And there are different aspects to that. Right? The remote caching part is almost the basis that you need, but you really benefit from the other features like an agent-based distribution, which means you automatically distribute work on multiple machines. We've seen some of that earlier this morning. Also things like automated task splitting. You have that huge Playwright or Cypress task, and you would automatically split that up into finer-grained pieces to be able to cache them more efficiently, but also run them across multiple agents more efficiently. As well as like flaky task detections, and also like recently we added some AI-based scaling, meaning we try to optimize between how many machines you have, so cost optimization and speed optimization, where you can kind of choose how much do I want to pay versus how much benefit do I want to get out of it. And this one is actually one of the main benefits there, which is like the whole version from I need to code my distribution on CI compared to NXCloud figures it out on its own. Right? So I don't have to code it and maintain it as my monorepo structure changes. But NXCloud uses kind of like a pull-based system where it just pulls in work as it needs to kind of get tasks done. Now, I, on purpose, didn't go into the details of this one because there's a talk right after this one on track 2, where some of my teammates are actually going deeper into all the different things that you can do with NXCloud and how you can benefit from it on CI. So NXCloud has remote caching built in, so as I mentioned just a couple minutes ago. But if for some reason you cannot use NXCloud or you don't want to use it right now, you have already AWS, for instance, set up, we recently also added a Power Pack that allows you to self-host some of the cache. Where we have it for AWS, S3, we have network-based caching, and soon also Google Cloud and Azure that are coming, where you can alternatively host if you just need the remote caching piece. So for AWS, as an example, what that means is you just pull in the plugin, you install that into your workspace, and then you get a bucket configuration. Ideally, don't use JSON's one. This is just like an example. You configure your bucket, and then you set it up on CI, and it would then allow you to actually have remote caching on your CI run. Right? And that's kind of it. If you need more stuff like agents, etc., you would then move to the next step to upgrade potentially to NXCloud. All right. So if we look back at the whole spectrum that I just mentioned initially, these are kind of the features that we kind of touched a little bit. So for the consolidation part, the migration phase, we have NX import and NX init, depending on which situation you're in. And we have the enhancing phase, where we have Annex release, for instance, which we didn't even touch today. We have the Annex generate commands, so we have the Annex migrate and code owners. And for the scaling, it's Annex cloud and S3 caching, which is more for the actual speed type of scaling, versus conformance, which helps you kind of scale at the team level, where you make sure that the thing remains maintainable in the long run. All right. So thanks for your attention, and definitely get in touch. This is our community. There's links to Discord, our YouTube channel, where you can reach out, ask more questions, and interact with us. So hopefully see some of you around there. Thanks.